The first time Everett Talbot heard the muffled sound coming from the barn, he thought it was the wind. Maybe the hinges groaning under the weight of another Wyoming winter. Snow had come early this year, falling thick and heavy over the pastures and swallowing up the fields in white silence. But then he heard it again, a low, broken whimper that didn't belong to any wind. It was too human. Everett paused, shovel in hand, breath hanging in the cold air like smoke. He had just finished clearing the front path, every bone in his back aching from the weight of it. His dogs hadn't barked, and that was strange. Something moved inside the barn again. He stepped off the porch and grabbed the shotgun leaning by the door. Not because he expected trouble, but because the world had taught him it often showed up without warning. He pushed open the barn doors and blinked into the dim light. The place smelled of old hay, horses, and something faintly metallic. Blood. At first, he didn't see her. Just a bundle near the stall, half covered in one of his old saddle blankets. Then the bundle moved, and he froze. It was a woman. She looked like she had crawled there. Her face was pale, lips cracked, and one eye was swollen shut. A deep gash ran down the side of her neck, crusted with blood. She clutched her side like something inside her was broken. But her eyes, her one good eye, were wide open, locked on him like she didn't trust him any more than whatever devil had driven her here. "You're safe," Everett said carefully, setting the shotgun down by the door. "Ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't answer right away, just stared like she was trying to decide if he was real. Then she opened her mouth, and her voice came out rough and hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Don't let him find me." Those 5 words landed hard. Everett felt them in his gut, like a stone dropped in cold water. He didn't know who him was, but the fear in her voice was deeper than any he'd heard in years. He moved slow, hands up, crouching just a bit so he wouldn't tower over her. "You're hurt bad. I need to get Doc Haley out here." "No," she gasped. "No law. No doctors. Please." Everett hesitated. He had secrets too. Things he didn't talk about. Not even with himself. A man with blood on his hands doesn't run to the law without good reason. And though he'd done his best to live quiet these past few years, he understood enough to see she wasn't just some runaway bride. Whatever had brought her here, it had teeth. "I won't call no one," he said, "but I gotta patch you up. You'll die if you don't let me help." She didn't speak again, just nodded once and let her head fall back against the wall. That was how it began. Everett carried her into the house, laid her on the couch, and cleaned the blood from her side. The wound was ugly, a knife or glass maybe. She never said, just bit down on a strip of cloth and stared at the ceiling while he stitched her up. Afterward, she fell into a deep sleep, and he sat nearby, listening to the wind howl against the windows. Her name was Julia. He learned that 2 days later when she woke up asking for water. Her voice was clearer, but the shadows behind her eyes hadn't faded. She said she came from north of Cheyenne, a little town called Elk Hollow. Everett didn't press for more. Not yet. He knew the world could be cruel to women, especially ones with no kin to protect them. He'd seen it before. Ranch hands who thought a wedding ring meant ownership. Fathers who believed fear was the same as respect. Men who smiled in church pews and beat their wives behind closed doors. But Everett wasn't anyone's hero. He hadn't been for a long time. Back in his younger days, he'd been known for throwing punches faster than thoughts. He'd gambled away nearly half the family ranch before his father's stroke knocked the wild out of him. He was a man trying to live right now, but redemption doesn't come easy, not when you don't believe you deserve it. Julia stayed, at first because she had nowhere else to go, and later because the roads were still blocked with snow. Everett didn't mind the company, though she spoke little and flinched when he moved too fast. She watched the windows, jumped at sudden noises, and refused to sleep through the night. Some mornings, he found her pacing the kitchen, knuckles white from gripping the edges of the counter. He never asked questions, but he noticed things, like how she kept her shoes near the door, like she might need to run at a moment's notice, like how she never let him walk behind her, like how she touched the scar at her throat when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the snow in gold, Julia stood by the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Everett watched her from the table, his hand resting near the revolver he kept close. Not for her, but for whoever she might be running from. "You got someone coming after you?" he asked finally. Julia turned, and her face went cold. "I had a husband," she said. "Thought if I married him, it'd stop. That he'd change." "He didn't." Everett nodded slowly. "He'd do that to you." She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. "He hurt my sister too," Julia added. Only difference is she didn't make it. Something in Everett's chest tightened. He'd known monsters before. Drank with them, played cards with them. Sometimes they smiled wider than saints. The kind of men who made you feel like you were crazy for seeing the truth. "What's his name?" Everett asked. But Julia just shook her head. "Don't matter. He's got money. Friends in places they shouldn't be. He won't stop." She turned back to the window. And I wasn't the only one. That was when Everett knew she hadn't just escaped. She'd survived something bigger. Something rotten down to its bones. And it wasn't over yet. He got up, poured himself a drink, and stood beside her. "Well," he said, voice steady, "if he comes here, he'll wish he didn't." Julia looked up at him. For the first time since she'd arrived, something soft passed over her face. Trust, maybe, or the ghost of it. She said nothing more that night, but Everett didn't sleep. He sat by the window, shotgun across his lap, watching the trees shift in the wind. He'd sheltered someone once before. Years ago, back when he still believed people could be saved. That time ended in gunfire and blood in the snow. He hadn't touched a bottle since. Now here he was again, watching, waiting, hoping he hadn't just dragged another woman into a storm neither of them were ready for. The next week brought clear skies and deeper silence. Snow still clung to the hills like thick frosting, but the wind had calmed, and with it, Everett sensed the storm was now inside the house. Julia had started to move around more, offering to help cook, feeding the horses, even stacking wood by the stove. But her eyes remained sharp, always watching, like the piece was a trap she hadn't quite stepped into yet. One morning, a rider showed up. Everett saw the dust long before he saw the man. A dark shape on horseback, cutting across the ridge with purpose. Most folks didn't come out this way unless they had business or trouble. He opened the door before the knock came. "Wyatt McCrae," the man said with a broad, too-easy grin. He wore a fine coat for ranch country, the kind a cattleman might wear to court, not to ride through snow. His horse was wet with sweat, like he'd been pushing hard. "I'm looking for a woman. Name's Julia. Pretty thing. Red hair. Might have passed this way." Everett didn't blink. "Never heard of her." Wyatt chuckled, like they were sharing a joke. "Funny thing. Word is she's run off with something that don't belong to her. Something valuable. Man she left behind's awful concerned. Said he'd pay good for her safe return." "She ain't here," Everett said again, voice like gravel. "And if she was, I wouldn't hand her over to the likes of you." Wyatt's smile tightened, just a flicker. "I hear you're not exactly a man who likes the law poking around his place. Strange what a sheriff might find if someone gave him reason to look." Everett stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You threatening me?" "Not all," Wyatt said smoothly. "Just trying to make things easy. Safe. For everyone." He tipped his hat, mounted back up, and turned his horse slow, deliberate. "You see her, you let her know folks are worried. Her husband's a powerful man. Got reach." Everett watched him go until he disappeared behind the trees, then turned back to the house. Julia stood at the window, face pale as paper. "That man works for him?" Everett asked. She nodded once. "Wyatt's worse than him in some ways. He enjoys it." Everett felt something cold settle in his gut. Whatever game this was, it had more pieces than he'd thought. Later that day, Everett rode into town. He didn't like leaving Julia alone, but he needed to talk to someone who knew how to keep their mouth shut. Jesse Kerrigan ran the feed store and had once been a deputy, back before he lost faith in badges and took to quiet living. They'd shared some hard years together, drunk nights, bad fights, and a few good secrets. "You ever hear of a man named Wyatt McCrae?" Everett asked, keeping his voice low. Jesse looked up from the ledger. "You don't want that name anywhere near your place. He's not a man, he's a shadow, tied up with that cattle outfit out near El Calo. Rumor is they've got lawmen in their pocket. Girls go missing. Money changes hands. Nobody talks." Everett leaned in. "He's looking for a woman. Says she stole something." Jesse shook his head. Even if she did, it don't mean it was his to begin with. On the way out, Everett caught sight of another familiar face, Bo Lindley, a rancher from 3 towns over. He was laughing with a group of men, but when he saw Everett, his smile faltered. Bo and Everett had bad blood, over land, over pride, and once over a woman. Talbot, Bo said with a slow nod. Heard you had company up at your place. Odd time for a house guest. Everett didn't respond. Bo never said anything by accident. If he knew about Julia, it meant word was spreading faster than snow melt. And Bo wouldn't hesitate to sell her out if it meant scoring favor with men like Wyatt. Back at the ranch, Julia was gone. The panic hit Everett like a hammer to the chest. He found her tracks in the snow, leading toward the river. When he caught up, she was sitting on a fallen log, clutching something wrapped in oilcloth. I can't stay, she said without looking up. I'm putting you in danger. If Wyatt's here, the others won't be far behind. Everett sat beside her, breathing hard from the run. You think I care about danger? I care about you not dying in a ditch because some bastard thinks he owns you. She looked at him, eyes wet. You don't understand. He doesn't just want me back. I have something he killed for. She unwrapped the oilcloth and held out a small, leather-bound ledger. Names, numbers, payouts, sheriff's names, judges' names. The whole thing stank of corruption, years of payoffs, trafficking routes, and women's names marked with red ink. He kept records, Julia said. Thought he was untouchable. Everett stared at the book. You planning to burn it? I was planning to run, she said. Take it to someone who could do something with it. But there's no one who ain't already bought. He nodded slowly, heart sinking. You got allies in that book? 1, maybe 2, but I don't know who to trust. Then trust me, Everett said. That night, Everett made a decision he hadn't made in years. He sent a message to someone he swore he'd never speak to again. Mae Devlin, an old flame who now worked out of Denver as a reporter. She specialized in stories that no one else would touch. If anyone could shine a light on this, it was her. Mae arrived 3 days later, wrapped in furs and fire. She took one look at Julia and understood. You sure you want to go public with this? She asked Everett as they talked by the fire. This ain't a simple story. It's a reckoning. I know, he said, but it's the right thing. Mae smirked. You used to hate doing the right thing. I still do, Everett replied. But some things you don't run from. Julia watched them from across the room. There was a tightness in her shoulders, the kind that didn't go away with time. But when Everett met her gaze, she didn't look away. She was still afraid. But now, she wasn't alone. None of them knew what would come next. But as the snow began to melt and the road out opened up, Julia stood beside Everett at the edge of the porch, ledger in hand, and said, I think I'm ready. And Everett, for the first time in years, believed something might be worth fighting for again. Spring came slowly to the hills, dragging its heels like it wasn't sure the snow had truly loosened its grip. But Everett could feel it in the air, in the way the sun lingered a little longer each day, and how the ice along the creek cracked and split with the promise of thaw. And in Julia, she moved different now, straighter. She still checked the windows, still startled at sudden sounds, but sometimes she laughed. Not often and not loud, but when she did, it stopped Everett cold, like hearing a song he'd thought was lost. Mae stayed longer than planned. The story in Julia's ledger was bigger than anything she'd ever handled, and she knew it. Every night, she sat at the kitchen table, typing up notes, cross-checking names, piecing together a web of rot that reached farther than any of them had guessed. But she didn't just come for the story. She came because once a long time ago, she and Everett had loved each other in that messy, half-grown way people do when they think life still owes them something. Now, Mae watched Everett and Julia with a quiet look he couldn't read. She never said much about it, but he noticed how she gave them space, how she left the room when their eyes lingered too long on each other. And those moments were happening more often. Julia had taken to walking the pasture each morning, so the air helped clear her thoughts. Everett started walking with her. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just walked side by side, watching the land wake up from winter. Sometimes she talked about her sister, Lucy, how she'd been wild and funny and never afraid to speak her mind. Everett learned Julia used to paint, that she liked dogs better than horses, and that she missed the smell of rain on pine needles more than anything. She learned that Everett had once buried a man with his own hands after a card game turned bloody, that he'd almost left the ranch after his father died, but stayed because he didn't know what else to be, and that he had dreams, vivid, bone-deep dreams, of hands reaching out from the snow, accusing and silent. "You ever wish you could go back?" she asked him once, when they stopped by the river. "Only every day," he said, picking up a stone and tossing it into the water. "But wishing don't change much." She nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. The nights grew warmer. Julia started sleeping without waking up in a cold sweat. She spent time with May, helping sort documents, cross-referencing names, piecing together the story that might finally bring her husband's world crashing down. There were small victories, finding a judge who hadn't taken bribes, a ranch hand who used to work for Wyatt and had kept quiet until now. They got a letter from a lawyer in Denver offering to represent the case pro bono. It was progress. Slow, hard-earned, but real. Still, the more ground they gained, the more Everett noticed Julia's hands shaking when she read names she recognized. The weight of it was always there, just beneath the surface. Some nights, she stood outside the house, staring into the dark like she was waiting for someone to come for her. One night, Everett found her that way. Moonlight catching the edge of her face, eyes glassy with something she couldn't name. "I'm scared," she said without turning. "I know. No. I'm scared that if this all works, if we win, I won't know who I am anymore. I've been running for so long. Hiding. Fighting to stay alive. What if I don't know how to live after?" He stepped beside her, close but not touching. "Then we figure out, one piece at a time." She looked up at him, lips parting like she might speak, but instead, she leaned into his chest, soft and sudden, and he wrapped his arms around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I don't want to be alone," she whispered. "You're not." But even as he said it, he felt the fear crawling up his spine, because nothing about this was simple. He wasn't a clean man. He'd buried his past, but hadn't stayed buried. And if Julia ever found out just how far he'd gone, how many wrongs he'd done to try to make something right, maybe she'd run again. Because Everett had his own secrets. The kind he'd never told anyone, not even May. Years ago, before he'd come back to the ranch for good, he'd taken work guarding freight wagons. One run went south. They were hauling more than goods. Girls, too. He didn't know at first. Didn't ask questions. But when he found out, he walked away. Burned the camp. Left bodies behind. One of the men he killed had ties to Julia's husband. He hadn't known the name then. But when he saw in the ledger, everything clicked. That fire Everett started, it might have lit this whole powder keg. He told May. Not Julia. Not yet. May didn't judge him, just gave him a long, tired look and said, "Truth always finds its way out. You better be ready when it does." They were getting close to making the story public. May was preparing to ride back to Denver to meet with editors and lawyers. The plan was to follow once things were in motion. Julia would testify. Everett would stand beside her. But the night before May left, someone torched the barn. Everett woke to smoke. The dogs were barking, fire roaring like a beast, flames licking up the walls like hungry tongues. He and Julia got the horses out just in time, but the structure was gone. Ashes. The ground still smoldering by dawn. In the rubble, Everett found a mark, carved into one of the remaining beams. A crude emblem, the same one burned into the side of Julia's old wedding trunk. Wyatt's message was clear. This isn't over. Julia stood in the blackened ruin, arms crossed tight over her chest. He's getting closer. Everett looked at her, at the fear creeping back in like rot. And he hated it. Hated that no matter how far they'd come, one match could undo it all. "I'm done hiding," she said suddenly. "If he wants to find me, let him. Let him see what I've become." There was fire in her voice now, real fire. Not panic, not dread, the kind that burns clean. Everett reached out and took her hand. "Then we do this together. No more running." She nodded once, jaw set. Together. They didn't know when Wyatt would come, but they knew he would. They could feel it in the air, in the tension that settled in their bones like thunder waiting to crack the sky. The past wasn't finished with them, but neither were they finished with it. The days after the fire passed slow and thick, like moving through mud. Everett rebuilt the barn by hand, one beam at a time. Not because he thought they had time to waste, but because he needed to do something that didn't involve waiting for Wyatt to strike again. Julia helped where she could, holding nails, handing tools, moving lumber. Her presence was constant, steady, but quiet. She hadn't cried when the barn burned. She hadn't even raised her voice. It was like something inside her had gone still, like the fire had burned through her fear and left something colder behind. May left the next morning, her coat reeking of smoke, her saddlebag packed with copies of the ledger and signed statements from 2 ranch hands willing to testify. She promised she'd send word once she'd met with her editor and the lawyer in Denver. Before she left, she pulled Everett aside, voice low and urgent. "She's strong," May said, glancing at Julia, who stood in the doorway watching them. "But strength isn't the same as safety. Whatever you think you owe her, make sure it's not built on a lie." "I don't lie to her," Everett said. May raised an eyebrow. "You haven't told her what really happened that night in Salt Creek. You haven't told her how deep you're tied to this." Everett didn't answer. "I know you," May said. "You bury things. But the past doesn't rot. It grows. And always reaches back." With May gone, the ranch felt more isolated than ever. Julia grew restless, wandering further each day. One afternoon, she came back with her coat torn and her hands scraped raw. "Fell," she said, brushing off Everett's concern. Cliffside gave way, but she was shaking, and her eyes didn't meet his. That night, Everett found a strip of cloth caught on a fence post, far from the trail Julia claimed she'd taken. It wasn't from her coat. It was black, rough, like a saddle blanket. Someone had been watching. They both knew it. Wyatt wasn't just sending messages anymore. He was circling. Tension gripped the house. Julia stopped sleeping through the night. Everett started keeping his rifle by the door, and the dogs paced the porch like they sensed something closing in. There was no more talk of running, only bracing for what was coming. One cold morning, Julia came into the kitchen holding a letter. No stamp, no envelope, just folded parchment left on the porch under a stone. She slid it across the table to Everett. He read it twice before speaking. "Julia, you've cost me time, money, and patience. But I'm a reasonable man. Return what's mine, the book, the name, and you'll live. Refuse, and you'll bury him next. You remember how quick I can take everything." D. Everett felt something shift in him, something old and violent that had been locked away for years. Julia sat across from him, staring at the table like it might swallow her whole. "I should go," she said. "He'll stop if I go." "No," Everett said, voice low. "That's what he wants. You give him that book, he erases everything. You go back, you disappear. I don't care about the book anymore." "I do," Everett said. "You matter. But so does the truth." They argued into the night, not yelling. Neither of them raised their voice, but it was a deep kind of fight, the kind that comes from fear wearing the mask of reason. Everett didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the darkness, remembering every man he'd killed, every sin he'd buried beneath whiskey and hard work. If Wyatt came for them, there'd be no warning. And Everett wasn't sure he could stop him. The next setback came fast. May didn't send word. A week passed. Then 2. Then Julia got a telegram, but not from May. It was from a printer in Denver. The editor May worked with had been found dead. Shot. Robbery, they said. But nothing was stolen except one leather-bound ledger in May's bag. The lawyer she was meeting? Gone. No record of the meeting ever happening. Julia crumpled the telegram in her fist. "He's covering his tracks." Everett nodded, heart hammering. "He's getting desperate." Desperate men made mistakes, but they also got dangerous. That night, Everett finally told her everything about Salt Creek, about the shipment, about the girls, about the fire, about the man with the snake tattoo on his neck, the one Everett had buried with a shovel in silence. Julia listened, silent, unmoving. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then, "You knew him." "I didn't know he was your husband's man," Everett said. "Not then. You killed him." "Yes." She looked down. "That night I escaped, I heard someone scream. A man. I always wondered if someone had tried to help me. Maybe distracted them. Gave me a chance to run. Everett blinked. That wasn't me. I never knew you were there. Julia nodded slowly. But you lit the fire. I did. For a long moment, they just sat in the stillness of that truth. Then Julia said, "You did something terrible. I know, but maybe it saved me. I don't know if that makes it right." Me neither. She stood, walked to the door, then turned. But it makes it mean something. That night, they shared a bed. Not out of passion, but out of fear, comfort, and the raw need to feel another heartbeat. It wasn't about romance. It was about surviving long enough to know what love might be like after the war ends. And then, just before dawn, the dogs barked. 3 riders. Everett was out the door with his rifle before he even had boots on. Julia stood behind him in her nightgown, shotgun in hand, hair loose and wild. The riders stopped at the edge of the yard. One dismounted. It was Wyatt. He held up a hand like they were just neighbors stopping by. "Let's talk," he called. Everett didn't lower the gun. "You set foot on this land, I'll bury you." Wyatt smiled. "Not here to fight. Yet. I just want what's mine." "You want her. I want justice. You don't know the meaning of that word. I know this. You give her to me now, and you both live. You keep hiding her, and I burn this whole valley." Julia stepped forward. "I'm not yours anymore. I was never yours." Wyatt's smile cracked just a little. "Then you better pray the law gets here before I do." He turned, mounted, and rode off with the others. But the message was clear. He wasn't leaving for good. Inside, Julia packed a bag. Not to run, to prepare. "I'm not going to die here," she said. "And I'm not going to live afraid." Everett nodded. "Then we finish this." They wrote letters, made copies of the ledger, mailed them to every newspaper, every court, every reporter May had mentioned. And they waited. For the law. For Wyatt. For whatever came first. The next few days were filled with silence, broken only by preparations. They reinforced the house, moved supplies to the cellar. Julia took watch during the day. Everett took the nights. Every sound felt louder. Every shadow stretched long with meaning. But something in Julia had changed. She wasn't the wounded woman who'd stumbled into his barn. She was sharp now, fierce, ready. And Everett, for the first time in years, felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Hope. It wasn't that he believed they'd win. It was that, even if they didn't, they'd go down telling the truth. Together. The sky hung low with gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Everett stood on the front porch, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the distant ridge where he knew Wyatt would come from. Julia was inside, her movement steady but tight, every sound in the house sharp as glass. The tension was more than fear. It was history piling up in their bones, demanding to be faced. And then, just past noon, the riders came, more than before. 6 men, Wyatt leading them like a wolf who knew the lamb had teeth now, but came anyway, out of pride or madness. Everett told Julia to stay inside, but she didn't listen. She stepped out beside him, her shotgun slung over her shoulder like she'd carried it her whole life. Wyatt dismounted slow, every motion deliberate, his eyes locked on Julia like he couldn't believe she was still standing. "You should have died in the snow," he said, voice low and cold. "You should have burned with the rest of that camp." Julia's voice was steady. "But I didn't. You didn't get to decide who I became." Wyatt looked at Everett, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "She didn't tell you what she did to my brother, did she?" Julia flinched, but only slightly. "He held me down," she said. "I killed him to save myself. I'm not ashamed of that." Everett didn't move. He didn't need to. Julia had already drawn her line in the dirt. Wyatt stepped closer, just past the fence line. That was the mistake. A single shot rang out, Julia's, clean through Wyatt's thigh. He fell hard, cursing, rage overtaking reason. His men scattered, some dismounted, a few fled. But Everett was ready. The firefight was short and ugly. One man went down before he fired a shot. Another grazed Everett's arm before Julia dropped him from a porch. The rest fled once they saw Wyatt crawling in the mud, blood staining the snow. It was over before the law arrived, and when they did, all they found was Wyatt tied up in the barn, his wound treated just enough to keep him alive. Julia handed over the ledger herself. her hands shaking only slightly. "He's the reason those women died," she said. "I can testify to everything." The sheriff, a grizzled man who looked like he'd seen too much already, nodded once. "We'll take it from here." They left with Wyatt that afternoon, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Julia didn't watch the horizon like someone waiting for ghosts. That night, Everett sat with her under the stars, his bandaged arm brushing hers. "It's done," he said, but she shook her head. "No, it's just beginning." She wasn't talking about trials or reporters or lawyers. She meant something quieter, something deeper. Learning how to live again, letting herself rest, letting someone love her without fear. Everett reached out and took her hand, rough fingers curling over hers. "We figure out together," he said. She leaned into him, no tears, no grand speeches. Just silence, honest and warm, stretching between them like the beginning of a new road. And in that silence, something broke open, not the kind that shattered, but the kind that let the light in. Spring came slow to the valley, the last snows retreating into the higher ridges while the creek behind the house began to flow again, swollen with meltwater and clear as glass. Julia stood at the edge of the fence line, watching the stream glitter in the morning sun, a bundle of fresh linen under her arm. It had been 3 weeks since the law took Wyatt, and still no word had come back from Denver. But no one had returned to claim vengeance. No men lurking on the ridge. No letters. No more fear humming under every breath. The quiet was strange, almost suspicious, like the land itself was still waiting to exhale. Everett had started sleeping through the night again. Not all the way, but enough that the darkness no longer felt like an enemy. He moved slower these days, not from age, but from a kind of caution that came from surviving something big. He kept expecting the world to crack again. It didn't. The ranch came back to life in small ways. A foal was born. The garden began to sprout. Julia planted wildflowers along the side of the barn, her fingers deep in the dirt, her hair tied back with a ribbon May had once left behind. Everett watched her from the porch sometimes, not with the wariness he once carried, but with something gentler, like watching a storm roll away after days of rain. They talked about rebuilding, not just the ranch, but everything else. Julia wanted to teach, not in a schoolhouse. She wasn't ready for that, but maybe letters or sewing or even just stories to children whose mothers didn't have time. Everett listened and nodded and didn't tell her no, even when the fear flickered behind his ribs. He just said, "Tell me what you need," and meant it. They'd moved her things into his room, not all at once. First it was a hairbrush, then a book. Then one night, she brought her blanket, laid it over his without a word, and climbed into bed indexes. 0. That had been weeks ago. It wasn't about romance, not yet, not quite, but it was about closeness, trust. The quiet way two people learn each other after the danger passes. There were nights they lay awake and talked, sometimes about the past, sometimes about nothing. She told him about her mother, how she'd taught Julia to braid hair with river reeds. He told her about the time he almost drowned trying to break a horse in the rain. They laughed, not loudly, not always, but the kind that caught them by surprise. One morning, Julia took down a box from the shelf, one she hadn't touched since the day she'd arrived. Inside was the last thing she owned from her old life, a necklace made of tiny river stones. It had once belonged to her sister. She held it out to Everett without speaking. He didn't ask what it meant. He just took it and placed it on the mantel, as if to say, "This house holds your memories now, too." A symbolic thing, small but deep. Days passed like that, work and quiet and new rhythms. Everett started carving again, something he hadn't done since his brother died. He made small things at first, wooden horses, little bowls, a spoon that was too crooked to use but sat on the table anyway. Julia watched his hands while he worked, the way they moved with care but not fear. One afternoon, she picked up a carving knife and asked if he'd show her. They sat side by side on the porch, hands brushing as he taught her how to whittle down a branch without splitting it. Her first carving was a fox with lopsided ears. She set it beside the spoon and didn't try to fix it. The day the letter came from Denver, they were sitting in the kitchen eating stew. Julia opened the envelope with careful hands. The sheriff had written. Wyatt had confessed, Names, dates, everything. The ledger had made its way into the right hands. There would be trials, but Julia wouldn't be called to testify after all. The case had taken on a life of its own. The newspaper even printed a piece about the corruption. Her name was never mentioned. When she finished reading, she slid the letter across the table. Everett didn't speak, just reached across and took her hand. "You're free now," he said. She shook her head. "I've been free since the day you didn't turn me away." He didn't argue. A few days later, they rode into town together for the first time. Heads turned. People stared. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered, but no one challenged them. Julia walked through the general store like she belonged there, her shoulders square, her chin lifted. She picked out fabric for curtains and a new pair of boots. Everett stood beside her, steady and unbothered, like they'd done this every week for years. At the counter, the shopkeeper, an older woman with sharp eyes, hesitated before ringing them up. Then she said, "Heard what you did. Heard it took guts." Julia smiled just slightly. "Took more than that. Took help." The woman nodded once and handed her the change without another word. Later that evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun fall behind the hills. Julia leaned her head on Everett's shoulder. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "I left too many things behind already. This is home." She nodded. "I think it is for me now, too." He didn't say anything, just kissed the top of her head, soft and sure. That night, they sat in the dark and wrote a letter to May. They didn't know where she'd gone, only that she'd be watching, somehow. Julia wrote it in her own hand, full of details, the good kind. She told May about the carving knife, the flowers, the foal, about peace, about healing. She didn't talk about Wyatt because that part of the story was over. On the first warm day of May, Everett built a swing behind the house. He didn't say why, just strung it between two trees and gave it a push. Julia found it the next morning and sat in it for an hour, rocking slow, her dress brushing the grass. It was a small thing, a quiet, symbolic thing, but it meant everything. No more running, no more hiding. Just this, a place to rest, a life worth keeping. They didn't talk about the future in big terms. No weddings, no grand plans. Just tomorrow we'll paint the barn, or maybe next winter we'll add another room. But when Everett reached for her hand, she didn't flinch. When he called her darling, she didn't correct him. And when she said home, she meant here. The past hadn't vanished. The scars didn't fade, but they stopped hurting in the same way. Pain became memory. Fear became something softer. And love, real love, grew not from fire or desperation, but from the quiet choice to stay day after day when it would have been easier to leave. Julia planted more flowers that spring, tiger lilies, the kind her mother once grew. Everett built a bench beside them and carved her name into the wood. She didn't cry when she saw it. She just sat down and whispered, "Thank you," like it was the only thing that mattered. And it was. That summer, she taught 3 neighbor children how to read. Everett fixed a neighbor's plow for free. No one mentioned the past. No one had to. It lived in their hands and their hearts, in the way they looked out for one another, in the way Everett still checked the locks each night. Not out of fear, but habit. Healing wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was slow and stubborn and full of cracks. But it held. And as the days stretched longer and the light lingered on the porch a little later each evening, Julia and Everett sat side by side, not needing to speak, not needing to plan. Just breathing, just living, just watching the horizon with open eyes. Not waiting, not fearing, just ready. At last,